Today we're going to cover the last lesson in Unit 9, which is margin of error. A margin of sampling error represents a limit on the differences between how a sample responds and how the total population will respond. So when I look at this, and if you have seen polls like on the news or in newspapers, you'll always see down at the bottom corner somewhere, plus or minus 3%, plus or minus 5%. That is the margin of error. The bigger sample size you have, the smaller that margin of error should be. But if you only have a very small sample size, that margin of error can be very large. So the margin of error formula is if a percent of people is in a sampling respond in a certain way, P, and the size in the sample, N, then 95% of the time, the percent of the population responding in the same way will be P minus your margin of error, and we'll simplify that with just MOE, and P plus your margin of error, where the margin of error equals, so here's your formula, 2 times the square root of P times 1 minus P all over N. So in this case, the only margin of error we're going to deal with is one that has either an A or B answer. So it's either this or this, there's no in between. It's yes or it's no. It's this person or this person, there's no third candidate. So that's what we're looking for when we're going to do this margin of error. There are other formulas that involve more than one sample choice or more than, 2 possible answers, but we're not going to cover those this year. So find the margin of error and round it to the nearest tenth of a percent. So in these questions, we are trying to find what the margin of error is. So my P is 76%. To put it in the formula, I need to know the decimal approximation or the decimal equivalent of that. So if you're not sure, remember it's move the decimal 2 places to the left, or simply divide by 100. If I divide by 100, my P is 0.76. So first thing we're going to do is we are going to write the formula. Margin of error equals 2 times the square root P times 1 minus P all over N. Now we're going to plug in what I know. 2 times 0.76 times 1 minus 0.76 all over my population size was 110. At this point, you are just going to type this, just like this, in your calculator. When you do, you will get 0.081. I need to turn that back into a percent. So to do that, I'm going to multiply by 100, which is 8.1%. So let's look at B. In a survey of 540 randomly selected high school students, so that means my N is 540, 60%, 3% of those surveyed said they were involved in extracurricular activities. So the question they had was, are you involved with extracurriculars or not? Remember, there's no middle ground. It's either a yes or a no. So my P in this case is 0.63. So we're going to write our formula. MOE equals 2 times P times 1 minus P all over N. And yes, you have to write the formula each time. It's the only way you're going to memorize it. 2 times the square root of 0.63 times 1 minus 0.63 all over 540. So you should get 0.042. And again, I multiply that by 100 to get 4.2%. So let's take a look at finding different parts of this. So those were just finding the margin of error. We're going to figure out how can we solve for N and how can we solve for P. So let's take a look. So in example 2, we are finding the number of people surveyed in each situation. So we are looking for the N value. So let's see what we have. We have P is 0.57. Margin of error, we need to turn that into a decimal as well. So that's 0.03. Remember, you divide by 100. Now we're going to write our formula. Margin of error equals 2 times the square root P times 1 minus P all over N. So I know my margin of error is 0.03 equals 2 times 0.57 times 1 minus 0.57 all over N. So first thing we are going to do is we are going to divide both sides by 2. Okay, I need to get rid of this. So that is 0.015. And at the same time, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to figure out what this number is so I don't have to keep writing it. So I'm going to just multiply that in my calculator and I get 0.2451. Now, how do we undo a square or a square root? We square both sides. So in your calculator, you are probably going to get something in scientific notation. In other words, in your calculator, you are going to get something like this, 2.25 e negative 4. Okay, this is how we write it. And we are going to keep it in our calculator and we are going to use the answer feature to help us solve this. And that equals 0.2451 over N. So to solve this, we need to multiply both sides by N. And then finally, to solve for N, I'm going to divide both sides by 2.25 times 10 to the negative 4th. So let me pause this. I'm going to pull up my calculator. I'm going to show you how to type this in, and then we'll get to the answer. Okay, so first thing we had was 0.03 divided by 2. Okay. From there, we needed to square it, so I'm just using the answer feature. I'm not typing anything new in. Okay, finally, I had my 0.2451 divided by, and I want to use this previous answer, so I'm going to arrow up, hit enter, and hit enter again. There is your answer. Okay, so we are using our previous answer feature every time to get the next answer instead of having to type it in. Make sure if you have questions on how to type this stuff in, you ask. Thank you. Let's go back to the paper now. So once I type that in, and move it up here, it said my N was 1,089.33 people. Can I have a third of a person? No, so we need to round, and when we talk about people, we always round down. I can't manufacture more people, so I need to round down. So I will say about, because it is a rounded answer, 1,089 people were surveyed. Okay, so let's look at B. It says 28% of people said they smoked cigarettes in the past week. So that is my p-value. The margin of error was 1.6%. So again, I divide by 100, so that's 0.016. So let's write the formula. Margin of error equals 2 times the square root p times 1 minus p all over n. So this is 0.016 equals 2 times the square root of 0.28 times 1 minus 0.28 all over n. So just like before, first thing I'm going to do, get rid of this 2. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2. I get 0.008 equals, and I'm also going to figure out what those two, the numerator is when I multiply it out, which is 0.2016. To undo, I am going to square both sides. So you get 6.4 times 10 to the negative 5th equals 0.2016 all over n. So I'm going to multiply both sides by n. And divide by 6.4 times 10 to the negative 5th. So if you need to pause it here to finish writing this down, do so, but I'm going to go back to my calculator and we're going to type it in. So I started out with 0.016 divided by 2. From there, I squared both sides. And I had 0.2016 divided by my answer. It comes out as a whole number, so that means I don't need to write about. That is the answer. So let's go back to our paper. So my N was 3,150. So I will say 3,150 people surveyed. Make sure you answer the question within the context of the question and don't just leave it as 3,150. 3,150 what? Okay, let's look at the last part. Now we're going to solve for P. So it says find the percent of people surveyed who said yes in each situation. So I'm looking for my p-value. So here's what I have. 2% is 0.02. So we start out just like we have. We write the formula. Margin of error equals 2 times p times 1 minus p all over n. I'm going to plug in what I know, so it's 0.02 equals 2 p times 1 minus p all over 1100. We're going to start out solving it the exact same way we just did. So I'm going to divide by 2, so I get 0.01 equals, and I'm going to go ahead and distribute this on top, so it's p minus p squared all over 1100. We're going to square both sides, so that's 1 times 10 to the negative fourth of p minus p squared all over 1100. We are going to go ahead and multiply both sides by the 1100 to get it out of the denominator. So I get p minus p squared equals 0.11. So let me take a second, show you how I got that number in my calculator before we move on to the next part of this. So we are going to start out the same way as what we did. So it was 0.02 divided by 2. Then we squared both sides. And now you had to multiply by 100. So it was times 1100. And that's where you get your 0.11 from. So if I go back to the paper, notice this is now a quadratic. And I want to move all of this over to the other side because I want my p squared positive. So it's going to become p squared minus p plus 0.11 equals 0. Since it is a quadratic, we are going to have two answers. Now, I won't know which one's the right answer, so you are going to have to include both of them. So we're going to do this in Desmos because it's much easier in there than it is in your calculator, but you can do it by plugging into your y equals and finding the zeros. But let me pull up Desmos and we'll plug this into the online calculator. So once we are in Desmos, we're going to go ahead and enter our quadratic. I'm just going to use x squared, or x instead of p, because I want to actually graph it. So as you can see, there's a bunch of little dots down here. Those are the dots I want. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in until I get a clear picture. And then I can click on them, and those will highlight and stay on your graph so you can write them down. So those are my two possible answers. You'll notice they do add up to be 1. Okay, your percent of your total people should always be 100%. So the ones that said yes and the ones that said no should add up to be 100%. So there are your two possible answers. So let's go back to our sheet and plug our information in. So how do we write this as an answer? So P equals, if I round it to the nearest tenth, 0.126 or 0.874. And again, these should add to be 1. If they don't, something's wrong. So to write my answer, I'm going to say 12.6% or 87.4% of people surveyed said yes. Again, I don't know which way the yes is, so I have to include both of them in my answer. So let's go on to the last example. Same kind of thing. According to a survey in the American demographics, 296 Americans age 12 or older said they listen to the radio every day. So that is our N. The survey had a margin of error of 4%. So remember that is 0.04. So first things first, I write the formula. And now we plug in. So that's 0.04 equals 2 times P times 1 minus P all over 296. Divide both sides by 2. I'm going to go ahead and multiply the top out. To undo the square root, we square both sides. Gotta move the 296 from the bottom, so I multiply both sides by 296. And I get 0.1184 equals P minus P squared. So my quadratic is P squared minus P plus 0.1184. Yes, leave the whole number there. Equals 0. Again, we'll plug that into Desmos. When you do, you will get P equals 0.137 or 0.863. So it is 13.7% or 86.3% of people surveyed said yes. Okay, that is it for today's lesson. Again, if you have questions, please let me know. Thank you.